Thank you so much. Thank you, Eileen. Thank you, Hillary. Thank you, JCC Chicago. I've been really looking forward to this. You know, we're going through a lot of tough times. COVID is rough on everybody, but one thing COVID has done is spur an interest in the home garden. There have been various newspaper reports about all the seed companies, and maybe it was due to the timing of the pandemic that people started ordering seeds more and more and starting their home gardens. And in tough times, it's true that gardening booms. I think we'd have even more gardening. I think there's a special interest in younger people in gardening, but oftentimes they don't have a yard, but even they can do container gardening. And today I'm going to talk about a plant that pretty much anybody can grow. It's not a popular home garden plant. And I'm going to show you what it looks like. This, my friends, is a horseradish plant. This came out of my yard about 2-3 weeks ago in anticipation of giving this Zoom talk. You can see these leaves are about, 4 inches long. And believe it or not, when this plant matures at the end of summer, the leaves on a horseradish plant are going to be probably around 18 inches long. So to compare this plant to a fully grown plant, I brought my tape measure. So I'll lean back. That's how long a single leaf is. This is set for 18 inches. So I'll tell you, if you grow horseradish, and I'm going to encourage you to do so in your home garden, it's an adventure and it's a real conversation starter, because when you have leaves that are 18 inches long, it looks like something that grew in the tropics. It looks like a jungle plant. And invariably, someone will look at your garden and say, "What's that?" And you get to say, "I'm growing horseradish." Horseradish, it's apropos that we're doing this Zoom for JCC Chicago, because you may not know this, Chicagoites, but Illinois is the #1 commercial producer of horseradish in the world. And you have a town, I've never been there, maybe I'll get to go there one day. It's called Collinsville. It's in the southwest corner of Illinois, across from St. Louis and the Mississippi River. And the dirt there is what's called loamy. Horseradish loves dirt that's loamy. What is loamy dirt? Loamy dirt is rich, fertile soil that doesn't have a lot of sand, and it doesn't have a lot of rock. It's loose, it's fertile, and it's loose. And that's what horseradish likes to grow in. And every year in Collinsville, Illinois, in the southwest corner in the Mississippi River Basin, they have a horseradish festival. So put that on your calendar, Chicagoites, to go visit Collinsville and enjoy horseradish festival. Maybe you want it on your bucket list, maybe not. But today I'm going to talk about horseradish, and I'm also going to talk about bitterness from a Jewish spiritual perspective, because I think there's a great analogy between how the home gardener can successfully grow horseradish and how to handle bitterness in our lives. So when you plant the horseradish, you plant just a piece of roots, about 3-4 inches. You can plant in early spring as soon as the ground can be worked. And the horseradish grows pretty much anywhere in the United States. It likes a sunny place, it likes cool weather, but it's such a durable, crazy plant, it'll grow pretty much everywhere. So if you're one of those people who are like, "Oh, everything I try and grow, I kill," not horseradish. You're going to be successful with this plant. And I'll tell you this, there's only one real trick to growing horseradish. If you have a beautiful garden already and you want to add horseradish to it, there's one red flag, there's one alarm bell, there is one important thing you've got to keep in mind. This plant, this plant, when it grows its root, and this fat part is the root, it's underground. What's going to happen is when it matures, there's going to be little side roots, little shoots that go off in unpredictable directions. And every place a side root goes, a new horseradish plant is going to pop up. And this is a plant that is insidious. It will grow like a weed unless you contain it. So one way to grow horseradish is to get a great big pot or container, really good for apartment dwellers, assisted living folks who have a patio or a balcony. Or you can put it on your own patio if you have a yard. Or maybe in your yard you have an area between the house and a cement walkway, someplace where it can't spread. Because the problem is when you dig it up, when you dig up the root, if the side roots, if these shoots have gone off in different directions, when you dig it up, you can get this main root, but those side shoots are going to stay in the ground. And when they stay in the ground, come spring, up pop all sorts of new horseradish plants. So the thing about horseradish for the home gardener, unless you want to have a horseradish farm, is to contain it. And this is the lesson Judaism teaches us about bitterness in our life. Let's face it, bitterness is part of the human condition. We're going to have disagreements. We're going to have relationships that go south, that's sour. There's going to be unrealized expectations between people. There's going to be massive miscommunications. Right now, our whole country is going through the most bitter of elections. Maybe this is a tradition for our country dating back to the days of Abraham Lincoln. But be that as it may, in our personal relationships, in our familial relationships, and familial disagreements have to be the worst, we're going to encounter bitterness. So what does Judaism tell us about bitterness? How do we deal with it? What Judaism tells us is that we need to contain the bitterness. If you let the bitterness grow, if you water it, if you fertilize it, if you focus on it, if you don't give it a break, the bitterness will grow. And that one relationship that's bitter can now flop over to the next relationship and the next relationship. And the bitterness grows and grows, and it can lead to horrible, unhappy consequences. It's a mitzvah, it's a commandment to be joyful, to be happy. Doesn't mean that we ignore bitterness. And when do we deal with bitterness? Well, in a couple months, we have that holiday when we fast, Yom Kippur. That's like the prime bitterness day of all time. When we're reflective, when we can study, when we can think, where we fast. We just had Tish B'Av, where we, the highly observant fast over the destruction of the temples in Jerusalem. And of course, we have the Shabbos, where every week we have a reflective time to turn off our rectangular electronic devices. And I'd say gardening is also a great way to deal with bitterness, to get outside, to smell the dirt, to make friends with an earthworm. So Judaism really does give us the way to deal with the bitterness in our life. And the same thing about growing horseradish applies to that. You know, when it comes to horseradish, what's your very first memory? I was just talking to Eileen and Hillary before we started, and Hillary is not a fan of horseradish, does not like horseradish. But guess what? Jews all over the world, even if they don't like horseradish, there's one day, or actually 2 days if they're not living in Israel, 2 days of the year, where many, many millions of Jews eat horseradish. Some like it, some don't, but almost everybody eats it. And that's Pesach, that's Passover. And I have a very distinct memory. When I was a kid, the family, I was the youngest of all the grandchildren, so I sat next to my grandfather. And we had the Seder at my grandparents' house every year. And everybody dressed all up, and it was a beautiful table, and my grandmother brought out the fancy dishes, and then it was time to eat the bitter herb. So it's a mitzvah at Passover to tell the story of Passover, and we had all those Maxwell House Haggadahs. Even though we were dressed so nice, we had the paper free Haggadahs, and you get to the point in the service to eat the bitter herb. And I remember so clearly, even though I'm in my 60s, my grandfather would take a white piece of horseradish, raw, and a pretty big piece at that, and he would eat the horseradish, and tears would roll down his face. Now, around the rest of the table, it was chaos at horseradish time. People were blowing their nose, people were yelling and screaming how hot it was. But my grandfather, who was at the head of the table, he would eat the horseradish, he would cry, and then he would go on. So even here, Judaism is telling us that we confront the bitterness in our lives, that we remember the bitterness. And in Passover, it's not enough just to tell the story. That's a mitzvah. That's a mitzvah. That's a commandment. But we also need to experience the bitterness of slavery. And how much more joyful is it to live and celebrate freedom and the Exodus and all of the gifts we've received when we taste the bitterness too. So that's a little bit about bitterness and how, from a Jewish spiritual perspective, how to deal with bitterness in our life. Of course, it's much easier said than done if you've had a family dispute, if you've had the bitterness of a dispute at work, problems with a neighbor. Speaking of neighbors, let me tell you one of the best things you can give your neighbor. If you grow your own horseradish and make your own horseradish, if you have a little more than you need, and a little bit goes a long way, give your neighbor a jar of horseradish. It's a surprising gift, but people like to get stuff that you grew in your garden. People always enjoy that, whether it's the tomatoes, the cucumbers, the zucchinis, the melons, the beans. The home gardener, you never know what you're going to get. I mean, you're participating in creation, which is always ongoing. And even though we have ideas about how to grow this, that, or the other, one year is a great year on tomatoes. The next year, it's like you have so much lettuce, it's amazing. The next year, you're Bugs Bunny with so many carrots. And it's fun to bring your stuff that you grew yourself into work, but to give your neighbor a little jar of horseradish, because one little jar can last a whole year. And this is how you make horseradish. You take this root, and it's probably going to be bigger than this, but really, even though this is an immature plant, it's big enough to make a little bit of horseradish. It really is. and you hose it off as best you can. You're not going to get all the dirt off with the hose. So what do? What do you need? You only need one tool. This, my friends, you use it to make latkes. Well, you also use it to make horseradish. It comes in handy. All you need is a potato peeler. Now, here's the thing. If you're a person who cries a lot when you're cutting up an onion, you might, when you're peeling the horseradish, you might want to put on some goggles. One thing you definitely want to do is open all your windows. Making horseradish is not for the weak of heart. You got to open all your windows, get the horseradish peeled, wash it off. Don't worry about getting water on it. Make it nice and clean. And then you need a tool. You need like your blender. You need something with a blade rather than doing it by hand. This one's called a Ninja. And you put your horseradish in chunks in your machine and you're going to mush it. You're going to make it into mush, but you're not going to over mush it. Why? If you over mush it, you're going to make it less strong. If you're like me and you're going to the trouble of making horseradish, you want it hot. So how do you make the mush? You add a little white vinegar, or you can add a little water, or you can add both. Obviously, the more water, the more vinegar you add, the less powerful your horseradish. And I like the traditional horseradish. Here's a beet, a red beet. Get the reddest beet you can find or grow. And beets, if you're a gardener, now come in all sorts of different shapes and colors. It doesn't matter on the shape, but I like the dark red beet because it gives the horseradish that great color. And again, you don't need to add a lot of beet to your mush. And once your mush is made, you're going to put it in a jar. You're going to put it in the refrigerator. You have extra. You put it in little jars and you put it in the freezer. It's not like canning tomatoes or making jam where you need a big seal. You just need a clean jar. And voila, you've made your own, very own horseradish. And when it comes time for that Passover Seder, you've got the greatest horseradish ever grown and made by humankind on your own Seder table. So that's my story about, that's my spiel on horseradish, but that's not all for today. I also want to talk about aging. And in my book, this is a copy of my book. It's called The Spiritual Gardener. Insights from the Jewish Tradition to Help Your Garden Grow. I wrote a story about a tree. And the tree was there when we moved into our house, and we called it the Old Catalpa. And it was a very old tree when we moved in. And we loved that tree. We absolutely loved the tree. The tree had a trunk that was like a playground for kids because they could climb up the trunk of the tree, and then where the branches started, they were really big, thick branches. It was kind of like a little platform or fort area. So for a certain personality of boys and girls between age maybe 6 or 7 and 11, when they saw that tree in our yard, they really wanted to climb the tree, and many a child climbed that tree and enjoyed that tree. So the tree was kind of a playground for kids. In the springtime, and mind you, I'm coming to you from Gig Harbor, Washington, where it's cold and wet and foggy and drizzly and windy and rainy in the springtime. But we would always get those teaser days, and you'd get that one hot day or a series of 3 or 4 hot days where, oh, let's go and sit out in the shade. of the catalpa tree. And in the canopy of the tree, you couldn't see the nestlings, but birds would build their nests, and you could hear all the chirping of the baby birds and feel the air and feel the springtime. So the old catalpa wasn't just a playground for kids, it was also a habitat for the beautiful birds of the neighborhood. And then when summer hit, you know, we don't have summers like Chicago, but we have our hot spells, and the catalpa tree would grow these big, big floppy leaves, and suddenly the tree became our air conditioner. And it just really, really made it nice and shady. It was fun to sit under, and it created so much shade for the house. So it was also an air conditioner. Now in Judaism, when we talk about old age, it's different than how our American society views old age. In this country, old age, just the term old age, has a negative connotation. Old is regarded as not so good, certainly not as good as new, as shiny. And we have a youth-oriented culture and society. Well, in Judaism, it's just the opposite. In Judaism, we venerate what's old. We have an ancient Torah. We talk about Rabbi Akiva, who didn't even become a rabbi until his mature years. And they say in Judaism, man is like a tree of the field. Well, think about, when is a tree at its most beautiful? When is a tree special? When is a tree at its most magnificent? When it's a young tree, or when it's at its apex, when it's fully grown and you can see how splendid, you know, it just exudes splendor as a tree. So when we think about aging, it's important to use the right terminology. So I like the word, for example, senior or seniority. And what's the opposite of senior? Inferior. What's the opposite of seniority? Inferiority. Would you rather be a senior or an inferior? What about the word maturity? Would you rather be described as mature, or would you prefer to be described as immature? There's maturity, and then there's immaturity. And I think as we approach retirement, our souls don't contract, our souls don't retire, our souls actually expand. And in retirement, I'll give you the example of my wife. Shout out to my wife, Donna. This week, as many a month, usually about 1 week every 4 or 5 weeks, she's a volunteer, and she works for a food bank where she graduated from being one of the people who worked on giving food to folks, to now she does financial grants. They recognize she had a Yiddish cup and was being underutilized, so they put her in charge of helping give people money grants. And this is what retirement lends itself to the chance to really be yourself, be comfortable with who you are, whether you're the greatest grandparent or a great-grandparent in the world, whether you're an artist or a volunteer. In my case, a lot of gardening and writing, which I really enjoy. I get to give a spiel now and again, which I enjoy as well. And it reminds me of a The point I'm making reminds me of a very old story in the Talmud, and you've probably heard it before, but it bears repeating. And it's about the Carrob, the old man in the Carrob tree. I don't know how many of you have heard this story, but there was an old man, and he was, I saw one hand go up. There was an old man, he was planting a carob tree, and a young man came by. And he said, "Old man, what are you doing? Don't you know that it takes 70 years for a carob tree to bear fruit?" And the old man said, "That's okay. Others planted for me. Now I'm planting for others." And I think that's really the way to approach aging and retirement. And, we honor our mothers and fathers, even when they're long gone, with their yard site every year. So that's a different way to look at trees and to look at aging. And I just want to speak up for the old trees. The older I get, the more affinity I feel to the beautiful magnificence of the trees in our natural world. Now, that's my spiel, but I want this to also be a discussion. So I'd like Hillary to open it up for questions, comments, for other spieling. I know with Zoom, it can be a little chaotic when people take their mute buttons off, but I'm certainly willing to give that a shot and look at everybody's faces. Now, if you want to talk to me, but you don't want to talk to me by Zoom, I have an author website, andybecker.life. Andy Becker is all one word, ANDY, BECKER.life. And there's some good things on that website. There's some what are called vlogs. What's a vlog? It's a blog with a video. So there's some gardening vlogs under the news and update section. In fact, there are 3 pages of vlogs on my website, and you can also email me through the website. The book itself, I want to give
Andy, I posted a link to your website in the chat,
Thank
so
you.
it takes people right there, and you can, if you haven't read the book, you can purchase the book from there. So it's in the chat box. If people need it, they should click on it before the call is over, just so it opens in their browser and they have it.
Thank you, Hillary. And let me say something about this book. This book is illustrated by this lady here. Her name's Abigail Drapkin, and she made some beautiful, beautiful watercolors. So the book is really intended to be a gift book. So if you have that special gardener in your life, or that special person you'd like to turn into a gardener in your life, or you need some inspiration for gardening and well-being, it might be a good present for you. Also, we do have what's called swag. What's swag? I don't know what swag is. Who knows what swag is? Swag, according to my son and his partner, is that you're supposed to not just sell your book, but you're supposed to have stuff. So they created for me a spiritual gardener coffee cup. I'm wearing my spiritual gardener t-shirt, which comes in the Carrot series. And check this out. Who wants a spiritual gardener raspberry t-shirt? So they come in different colors. Somewhere, oh yeah, maybe for the younger set, spiritual gardener socks. Now you're talking. Now you're talking. So there is swag on the on the website. And if you want to buy the book from your favorite online bookstore, like that big company that starts with the letter A, that's fine. But if you buy it direct from me, I'll autograph it for you. And it's a little cheaper because I throw in a discounted price. It's $16 plus I pay for the postage. So it's free shipping and autographed direct from me. But if you want to go use that A company or any of the other online bookstores, it's available at all those different bookstores, and you can get it there. Okay, Hillary, who's got a question, a comment? Who wants?
We got some questions. We have some comments. So what inspired you to write a book like this? You love gardening. You clearly are proud to be Jewish. What inspired you, or who inspired you to start writing?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it had to do with retiring. I was a lawyer by profession. And as I cut back from the lawyering world, which I found more and more full of vitriol, I said, well, I can write about something I know about. And even though I'm not a rabbi, even though I'm not a master gardener, these are two ancient traditions that have been with us forever. And I had many years of both under my belt, many successes and failures in both traditions, I can guarantee you. So I thought it would be kind of fun to put them together with the idea of inspiring others to find the kind of joy that I found out in the yard, pawing in the dirt. And I have found a lot of fun. And I have made a lot of friends with earthworms and learned over time. And I approach Judaism also as something that I enjoy. So I put them both together, and that's what produced the book. Now I'm working on a sequel to The Spiritual Gardener about trees, which I'm going to call The Spiritual Forest. So stay tuned. That could be out in a couple years. Maybe I'll do a book launch, a book party when that comes out on a Tu B'Shvat holiday. That would be a dream come true. And then I have another book I wrote, which is kind of a testament to childhood, growing up in the 50s and 60s. And it's really kind of a love letter to my family, especially my mom. And I have a copy here. It's called Cracking an Egg. And if you grew up in the 50s or 60s, based on people who've read this book, you're going to enjoy it. It's a humorous book. It's funny. You can get that one from me for $2 less than the other one. Why? Because it's not illustrated. My illustrator and the printing for illustration is more expensive, so I'm able to sell that for a little less dough.
What kind of research did you have to do to write the book, if any? I mean, was it gardening research? Obviously, you did some research with respect to the Torah passages and the quotes at the beginning of each chapter. So I'll let you answer that, and then I'll ask part B.
Epigrams. Thank you, Mr. and Ms. Google. The epigrams were surprisingly easy to find. Once I had my theme, each chapter has a theme. Like the old catalpa is about aging. Horseradish is about bitterness. I have a chapter on raspberry jam, which is kind of about how Judaism sees the division of labor in marriage. There's a chapter called TikTok Early Spring Gardener. How does Judaism view time? But it's also about gardening. You know, what's it like in the Puget Sound area near Seattle when it's February, March, and everything's all wet and cold, and it's time to get outside and plant some lettuce and some radishes. And the clock is ticking. And what's gardening like if you don't pay attention to the seasons and when things are timely. So the epigrams, thanks for mentioning that. So each chapter has a theme, and each chapter starts off with a quote. So I found, I just, would search around, I'd find fun quotes that range from the Baal Shem Tov to Groucho Marx. And it was not hard finding good quotes to fit various themes. There is, in fact, when it comes to Judaism and nature, some real heavy hitter Hasidic people in our past, some real super duper rabbis who love nature, who talked about nature. Going back, I mentioned Tish B'Av, going back to the times of the destruction of the temple. And so there is quite a lot of literature. And then what I found, what's leading to the next book, The Spiritual Forest, is I found so much stuff in my research about trees. So far I have about 17 chapters on different aspects of Judaism and trees for the next book, The Spiritual Forest.
Did you pick the quotes first and then write the chapter, or vice versa?
Versa. That's an easy one. Vice versa.
That was an easy one. Someone asked if you went to yeshiva or day school, and did that give you inspiration for writing the book? I guess we really want to know how the connection between gardening and Judaism. You make it clear as you read the book, but how did you get the inspiration?
I would say that I grew up in a very Reformed household. My grandfather, who led the Passover Seder, was a real Zionist. He was an immigrant from Poland. He named his first child Menachem Mendel, my Uncle Mickey, but yet he was not observant. He was not observant. He read the foreword in Yiddish. I remember him in his house reading that paper. I saw him frequently. He lived right across the street, and as a young boy, I would go across the street to play chess with him because no one else in my family would suffer playing with me, but he would. And we spent many an afternoon playing chess together. But he was not observant. He was more the type who would go by the synagogue and have some money in an envelope and drop it off to the rabbi and then go eat Chinese food. And I really think it was a product of my children and their Jewish education, particularly a very close friend, because at their bar mitzvah times, they're such angels and they're such devout Jews. And we had one friend in particular who really led them down that path, who tutored them in Hebrew. And I really think I was inspired by my kids. Now, what calls someone to go dig up the earth and gardening? Because I've been gardening forever. And, there's all sorts of psychological studies and sociological studies and even medical studies on the benefits of gardening. But that's not why I garden. I don't know why I garden. It's tick-tock, early spring gardener. You want to be outside. You like to see things grow. There is a spiritual aspect to it. There's just an enjoyment to it. It's just fun. It gives me peace. It gives me that shalom aleichem. It's a wonderful thing to get out in the garden and grow some tomatoes and cucumbers, and you're enjoying a warm day and you're standing out in your short pants watering the plants. So there's all sorts of articles about the benefits of gardening, and I don't discount any of them in terms of health, in terms of lowering your blood pressure, and eating stuff that you grow yourself. My raspberries are, 10 times better than the price of raspberries in the store is outrageous. It's insane. But my raspberries are so much better. They come back year after year. I prune them, I weed them. My wife makes some great raspberry jam. Sometimes I help, sometimes she's gone and I have to make the raspberry jam. That's always an adventure. But, gardening is something I love. What brings you to your garden? Why do you like gardening? Why do you like going to shul? What makes you Jewish? These are all great questions. They really are.
When did you start writing the book, and how long did it take you?
Yeah, that's really interesting. It probably took me from start to finish about 2 years. It took me basically one fall and winter to write the first draft. And that's the most fun part, the most creative part, when you get that first draft done. And then after that, it's all work. Then you have to give it to the editor, and then you're waiting for the editor to edit. And then you finally get it back. And then you've got to find an illustrator, and then you've got to come up with a cover. And then you're proofreading about 100 times. That makes you crazy. So that part is kind of a grind. That part isn't the funnest part, but the creative part, and then it's very satisfying. And today, it's fun. Let's say I'm going to give a talk on a different theme. I'll go back and read a chapter of the book, and I'll be like, oh, I'm enjoying this. It's like you surprise, oh, I wrote that. You kind of surprise yourself. So it can be really, really fun to write something. But from start to finish, pursuing it, fairly aggressively, I think the turnaround is probably a couple years.
That's pretty short compared to some of the other authors that we've talked to, where it's taken 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 years on and off. So I'm really impressed with that.
Well, if I could say something, I'm Andy's wife, and so 2 things. First, the tutor that he's talking about is on this call, Tova Akdut, who was the greatest tutor for our kids' bar mitzvahs. And really spurred our whole family into being more observant. But I think Andy is, really, he worked really hard on the book, and, just spent a lot of time during those 2 years. And initially, when he told me and the kids he was going to write a book, and our kids are grown, we're all like, yeah, right, kind of like whatever. But it turned out so good, and it's such a great little book, and we're just really proud of him. Anyway, I just wanted to say that.
We're recording this, so now he'll have it for posterity that you said that stuff. So thank you for letting us know that.
I gave her a shout out about her volunteer work, so it's just embarrassed me back. But
she took on a very difficult volunteer job. It's not always so easy to get and ask for money, so that's also very impressive.
One of my kids, after the book came out, was like, "Where's my copy? You haven't given me. Where's my book?" And I said, I gave you the book. Of course, when he got the book, it was fresh off the printer, and he had it in manuscript form, and then he had it a second time Actually, I sent it to him and his wife as a Hanukkah present, but he was like, where's my book? I want my autographed copy. So he finally, he lives in Denver. So when we finally had a visit, I was able to give them a copy. And on a subsequent visit, I was very happy to see it was sitting on his coffee table for all to see. Another side benefit of this book is when you contract for watercolors, the artist gave me I didn't just get the watercolors digitally, but I got the actual watercolors. So for example, there's a chapter called The Greenhouse, which is about having a best friend and the value of having a best friend. It's about building a greenhouse. And I did that with a friend of mine, David, and the artist really captured how David looked and how the greenhouse looked in building the greenhouse. And it was so much fun to give him that painting and to give each of my kids one of the paintings, one of the beautiful watercolors that the wonderful illustrator Abigail produced for us.
They are beautiful. So if you haven't seen them, definitely get the book. How has gardening helped feed your Jewish soul? Like when I don't know, when you're outside digging, are you thinking about a passage from the Torah? Or do you think about, something that happened in synagogue while how does that feed you Jewishly?
Yeah, I would direct you to my vlog on my author website, because I'm talking about Judaism on the vlog, similar to the chapters, and you'll see specific examples. For example, there's a vlog about weeding, and there's a chapter in the book about weeding. And weeding is about humility, and I forget which quote I used, but there are Hasidic masters who've told us that we as human beings have this certain arrogance about our place in the universe, and that really we weren't made last because we were the most important, but possibly the least important. And we shouldn't put ourselves above the worms or the insects or even a blade of grass. And when you think about humility, what activity could be more humble than being bent over your garden bed picking the weeds? I mean, you don't need a PhD to do that. You're not an elitist when you're picking the weeds. You're almost in a prayer-like position. You're listening to the birds chirp. You're outside, you're breathing the air, you're breathing the dirt, and you realize that you have a front row seat to this world that was created, and that creation is ongoing. So that would be an example of how I would answer that question. If you want more examples, go to the news and updates, and there's some different videos. I've also got one of my kids on there. I have him talking about how to build raised beds for his garden. He lives in a little bungalow in downtown Denver, and so he didn't have much of a sunny yard, so he took out a struggling lawn in the front of his house and put in 2 raised beds. And he is like phenomenal what he can grow with that strong sun of Denver, Colorado. His tomatoes, his peppers, his kale, it's amazing. And he even has made friends with little kids across the street, other neighbors who come by when he's picking his stuff and watering and so forth. So there's one vlog that talks about how do you build raised beds, and then there's another vlog that shows his garden in its fullest growth and in all its splendor.
So do your neighbors and friends like to come over and do their produce shopping?
Yeah, I do have friends and neighbors who will come over, and on their way to the patio, they pass by the raspberries. And I have a big stretch of raspberries next to a fence. And that little stretch of walking on the lawn takes an inordinate amount of time for certain friends. Because you have to pause and get the bill. So I think that's fair. And then a lot of people say, give me a tour. Let's see what's in the greenhouse. My friend who helped me build the greenhouse always puts his head in. He always wants to see what's going on in there. And people like to look at your flowers and your vegetables. And it's always fun, especially kids, because there are a lot of kids who haven't seen stuff grow and haven't picked stuff, and it's fun to give a kid a bag and say, okay, you can go pick a couple things, and they really seem to like that quite a bit.
I imagine that you and your wife can't possibly eat everything that you grow in the garden, so do you give some of it away as, tzedakah, or to people who might not have the opportunity to have really fresh grown produce?
Absolutely. And you'd be amazed. There are a lot of food banks. In some years, you just get so much of one thing. I don't know if you know what spaghetti squash is, but it's like this big squash, and you cut it in half and you bake it. And then, once you get the seeds out, you rake it with a fork, and it comes out in strips like spaghetti, but it's not spaghetti. It's a wonderful vegetable. And one year I just had so many spaghetti. It was like the wheelbarrow wouldn't hold them all. It was like a crazy spaghetti squash year. So you can always bring stuff. I would say more. I usually haven't produced so much that we're dropping off much at a food bank, but we have done. But it's more like giving to your friends and neighbors and your coworkers, people at the office, that kind of thing. And people always get a kick out of that when you have so much you can.
Is it an organic garden, or?
Yeah, it's totally organic, and that's also a variable aspect. We don't spray anything, and what you learn over time is there's some things that are just a disaster if you're not going to use chemicals, and we're not. So for example, cabbage, I've just given up. I mean, I had a couple years where I grew cabbage, and we had this one friend who came over and said, oh, I'm going to show you how to make borscht, and we made a great cabbage soup. It was wonderful. But most years, my cabbages, there's just little bugs that get in there. I don't even want to think about them. So I've just given up growing cabbage. Lettuce, I find that red lettuce is not attractive to, our biggest problem is slugs here in Washington because it's wet. Now, we had a couple years recently where there was an opossum in the neighborhood, and the opossum was eating all the slugs and not eating any of the vegetables. But this year, the opossum went away, and what we do is we have a dog, so we take our chuck-it. It's a thing, you've seen them, where people throw the ball with this plastic deal, and the chuck-it has a cup. So we have two chuck-its. So my wife and I at night, when we have the energy, on a nice misty night in springtime, we'll go out slug hunting with our chuck-its. And we find that these slugs like to, kind of curl up, and they fit in the chuck-it. You can probably get 5 to 10 slugs in a chuck-it, and then we throw them we have a big blue for the refuse that they come and pick up, and it has a lid, and the slugs have not figured out how to lift up the lid and crawl out yet. So that's how we've been dealing with our slugs. The other pest that we had for years, although their population seems to be down this year. We're seeing a lot of reports of coyotes, which is probably why their population is down, is the bunnies. And I have a chapter in the book called Damn Wabbits. And it's about bunnies coming into your garden. Another problem people have are deer. So my solution for the bunnies and the deer is I have temporary fencing. I built very cheap frames and then stapled bird netting to the outside of the frames. And then I can pick it up and put it on and off the vegetable beds so I can get in there to harvest, to weed, to do whatever I need to do, to plant, to seed, you know. But then the rest of the time, the dog can't get in there, the bunnies can't get in there. And the deer could get in there, but we have most of our yard is fenced, so they don't trouble us that much. But I was talking to a neighbor just a few doors down. The deers, they have an exposed garden and goodbye garden. The deer, they're like, what do I do about the deers? And I'm like, without fencing or something else, there's really nothing to do.
I think the opossum and the wabbits are in my backyard now. So, and I don't have a garden, but we do have a family of rabbits that live underneath our shed. And one of my dogs has cornered the opossum more than once.
And the opossum, the dog just barks at the opossum, right, Hillary? And the opossum just kind of stands there.
Yep.
Yeah.
Plays dead.
Yeah, it's a scandal.
If anybody else has any questions for Andy and they'd like to unmute themselves and ask, please do so now. Otherwise, we are going to wrap up and say thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. Donna, thank you so much for sharing a little bit more about Andy. We really appreciate it. This was, I might be inspired next year to try and grow some things. We've grown things in the past, but gave up, but maybe I'll try again and reach out to you with some questions. But thank you so much. It's always so nice to try and take, that Jewishness, that Torah and Talmud and praying and prayers and bringing it into something that you can do every day that's tactile. So that's great. Oh, I think we have one question.
Tell you, Hillary. Go ahead.
So what motivated you to write your books? I mean, like, I understand Jewishness, but I mean, it wasn't like you thought back when you were a kid, I'm going to write a book. Have you always wanted to write?
Always.
Yeah. What about since high school?
Yeah, I actually wrote a novel back in between high school and college years.
Wow.
It's shrunk somewhere in the basement. I need to go find it and burn it immediately. And the theme was about, I'm sure it's horrible, but the theme was about the polarization of America way back then.
Wow.
Did you recall, I'm in my, I'm 66. So if you're out of the 50s and the 60s, as you'll recall back then, when I was in high school, we had the Doves and the Hawks. And so when I look at what's going on politically now, I don't see that much difference. I just see a different degree of it. But it's been kind of the same schism. And it's not limited to this country. I mean, if you read, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, where he's talking about the early years in Colombia, where there were the Republicans and the conservatives and so forth. There are these themes throughout history. But yeah, I wrote a book way back then. I took a little break from writing to go to law school and be a lawyer. And then the minute I stopped being a lawyer, I wrote a collection of lawyer short stories. the problem with those stories is even though I have fictionalized all the characters, the stories are true, and the people in my little legal community will recognize those stories. So I can't really ever, maybe posthumously that book could be edited and published and turned into something. But if I published it today, my kids and wife have seen it and they've enjoyed it. And it's a funny book. The childhood stories are all true and all funny, although there's definite, license taken with some of the stories. And the same with the lawyer short stories. But I don't feel comfortable. I think it would be hurtful to some people who might, if you've ever seen yourself written about in a newspaper or in a book, it's just the weirdest thing. I mean, you don't recognize yourself and you take great exception to whatever's been written about you. It's just how people are.
Well, Andy, thank you again. We appreciate your time. We're grateful for the opportunity to share this with everyone and to read it for ourselves. So we wish you the best of luck. Please let us know when the next book comes out. Maybe we can have you come to Chicago and meet with our community in real touchable person.
Hillary, this has been so much fun. I want to thank you. I really enjoyed it. And I'll just close by saying, as a great sage once said, and I'm going to hold you to this next spring, Hillary. I want to see you plant something. As a great sage once said, make your home a garden. Thank you, everybody, and
Thank you. Good night.
good night. Take care.